Welcome to the Neurology Live Mind Moments podcast. Tune in to hear leaders in neurology sound off on topics that impact your clinical practice. I'm your host, Marco Meglio, editor with Neurology Live. In this episode, we sat down with Dr. Lara Jehi, an epilepsy specialist and Cleveland Clinic's Chief Research and Information Officer, to discuss a recently published study that explored using machine learning algorithms to predict seizure control after epilepsy surgery. In the interview, Jehi gave background on the different types of machine learning, the idea behind utilizing periictal scalp EEG, and some of the notable findings observed from the trial. She also spoke on the team needed to properly implement machine learning techniques for neurosurgery while providing recommendations for other institutions. Let's dive in.
As you've outlined, machine learning disciplines within AI have really gained a lot of attention, a lot of weight recently. And that's not surprising, mainly because there is a lot of data now that is at our disposal that we can use. And in general, machine learning disciplines are split into what we call supervised versus unsupervised learning. So the unsupervised learning approach is where you just ingest large amounts of data and sort of let the algorithm do its thing in learning from it. And supervised is the opposite, right? Like you tell it what to look for, you tell it what's in the data, and then it has to learn from that. And the evolution that we've seen over the past few years is a trend that is more towards the unsupervised approach because of the two things. First is the large amounts of data that we have, as I mentioned. But then second is also evolution in the discipline of machine learning itself, where now we have just so many different algorithms that people can apply and implement. And because of tools that allow us to test all these algorithms in parallel. So like in this paper, for example, we use this approach called AutoML, so auto machine learning, where it is automatically testing many different algorithms on the data and then making it easier for us to pick which one of these approaches or so you go usually with 5 and you rank them, the top 5 will have the best performance. So it's become easier to implement the compute and there is more data. So that's where, in the bigger picture of machine learning, how the field has evolved.
Well, it's very, very interesting, and to hear a lot of the different types of approaches that are kind of being implemented. We see it obviously being tested out in a lot of different clinical research settings across neurology, to say the least. So talk a little bit about some of the actual specific research. What did it encompass? And just give our audience a little bit of an overview of some of the findings and things of that sort.
In this particular study, we leveraged the fact that we have a very well phenotyped, a very well characterized large patient cohort that went through the whole exercise of being tested for brain surgery for epilepsy and then having the procedure and then having a long enough follow-up afterwards so that we know if the surgery worked or not. In the world of machine learning, sample size, so the cohort itself is a very common challenge because in general, neurological conditions, particularly epilepsy, are much rarer conditions than things like heart disease or, strokes or diabetes, where it's very easy for machine learning algorithms to get thousands of patients, to build models on. In epilepsy, the disease itself is much rarer. The subgroup that ends up having brain surgery is even smaller. So it is very difficult to collect large enough samples to do good machine learning research on. In our situation, because of the history that our team has with studying epilepsy surgery and doing research on it for over a decade now, we have been able to collect the largest cohort of epilepsy surgery patients. and collect all these outcomes on them. So that for us resolved the first challenge, which is the sample size issue, the having number be big enough. The second advantage of this particular research study is the type of test, the type of data input that we used, which is scalp EEG, so the routine EEG that every patient with epilepsy gets. We were very intentional in choosing that as opposed to what is commonly used in machine learning research in epilepsy surgery, which usually is either intracranial EEG, so surgeries where electrodes go inside the brain to record. That's a much more elegant, procedure, but it is very risky for the patients. And most people who get brain surgery don't go through an intracranial evaluation. So whatever you learn from that isn't going to be generalizable or helpful for the larger cohort of patients with that disease. Or other studies have used very complex imaging algorithms. You do a very special type of MRI and then you process it in a very special way. So again, it's a very interesting intellectual exercise, but it's not going to help people because the vast majority of patients being worked up for epilepsy aren't getting those things done to them. The attractive thing with scalp EEG is that this is the bread and butter of evaluating any patient with epilepsy anywhere. So every patient who is getting epilepsy surgery is going through that procedure. So if we can learn anything from a scalp EEG, whatever that knowledge is, it will be generalizable and helpful, to the population at large. So those two principles, us wanting to do good science, and that would require having a large enough sample size, and us wanting to do helpful science where we are looking at studying something that could be clinically translatable, those two principles really drove this study. And that's how we designed it. We took the cohort, we analyzed their scalp EEG, focusing on just a few minutes before and after seizures, and then processed the EEG in a way that allowed us to implement, the different machine learning algorithms that we were interested in, and then ended up finding that the predictive value, the information that we get just from those few minutes of EEG is right now the most accurate prediction algorithm that is out there, regardless of the modality, regardless of even algorithms that combine different modalities.
We're going to take a quick break from our conversation with Dr. Jehi to keep you up to date on the latest developments in neurology. Welcome to the Neurology News Minute. Here's what you may have missed since our last episode. First, on November 4th, the FDA cleared an investigational new drug application to test the effects of HG202, the world's first ever CRISPR/Cas13 RNA editing therapy for the treatment of neovascular age-related macular degeneration. The Phase 1 open-label dose escalation study, dubbed BRIGHT, will assess the safety and tolerability of the treatment. The next day, on November 5th, the FDA accepted PTC Therapeutics' resubmitted new drug application for its protein restoration therapy Ataluren for the treatment of boys with nonsense mutation Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Because this was an NDA resubmission following a complete response letter filed several years ago, the FDA is not obligated to follow PDUFA review timelines and thus did not provide an action date for the therapy. Days later, the FDA placed a clinical hold on Rapport Therapeutics' submitted investigational new drug application for the initiation of a Phase 2A proof-of-concept trial assessing RAP-219, an investigational therapy for epilepsy, as a potential treatment of patients with diabetic peripheral neuropathic pain. For more information about these stories, head to neurologylive.com, or you can check out the corresponding link in the show notes. And now, back to our conversation with Dr. Jehi.
You obviously talked about the feasibility of the scalp EEG and that, it's able to be kind of used a lot of different areas. So just talk a little bit more about that aspect specifically. How are we going to be able to sort of translate what we see in this study across the world and to other places, and even to other places that may not have as many resources per se?
Sure, Marco, that's a great question. And it is also a goal of mine and my team to develop tools, surgical prediction tools that would be of benefit to the whole world. I think that the last time that we talked about the nomograms that we developed, these online risk calculators, which are now used all over. We can track their use because it runs on our server and we have the addresses, so we know from which part of the world it's running on. And it's being used over the last time that we looked, it was 9,000 times per year, which is a good number considering that there is 2,000 to 3,000 surgeries that happen in the US. So it tells you the rest is really happening. It's being accessed and used everywhere else in the world. My goal from this research now with machine learning is to get to that level of universal use. And that is why we looked at the scalp EEG, because now the only hurdle I have to overcome is moving from the algorithm to implementing it in a software platform that could be integrated, say, with EEG acquisition machines, or that people could download publicly and implement on our patients. That is a big hurdle, but at least I don't have to overcome the fact that intracranial EEG or functional MRI or post-processing of MRI studies are, by definition, infrastructure requirements that would be way too expensive for anywhere outside of Cleveland Clinic and a few select centers in the US to actually implement, right? So starting from a place where I know that even in the middle, in really underprivileged communities and low middle income countries, scalp EEG is routinely done. And I know that because of my activities within the International League Against Epilepsy and, interactions with epilepsy providers in those countries. Scalp EEG is really done everywhere. So at least the data input is not going to be a hurdle to scale this algorithm. The next step is figuring out how to integrate it in, software packages that could be implemented elsewhere and integrated with acquisition devices, sort of how, say, take the imaging research, for example, like there is the diabetes community. You probably are aware of that, but there are these algorithms that they developed from ultrasound images or pictures that they take from the retina that they can run and then provide a diagnostic recommendation. Oh, this is retinopathy or it's not. And then these algorithms are now used in portable devices in India, like in the middle, in rural communities, to help disseminate the ability to make diagnoses. So that is a technical challenge with how do you implement an algorithm in a portable machine, that you can that you can execute on more broadly. But that's the kind of challenge that we're dealing with, right? So it's solvable, but it's going to take a lot of work from where we are right now. First, we have to reproduce our these results in cohorts outside of Cleveland Clinic. We have to reproduce those findings in epilepsy types outside of temporal lobe epilepsy. And then we have to solve the technical issue of integrating it in a device.
Dr. Jehi, I'm also curious, talking about some of that integration. Obviously, you don't have all of the answers yourself right now, but when you guys were integrating this into your system, did you feel as though that there were any sort of key members or key pieces of people within the system that you feel as though if you were giving a recommendation to other systems that they should be including these sort of specialists or whoever it may be? Just talk a little bit about the team that is kind of needed to implement this properly so that, this is being used in the right ways, I guess, per se, going forward.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. I'm so glad that you asked about the team. That's really important because the way science is done nowadays is really far. We are very far from the days where a brilliant epileptologist can just be sitting in their office and come up with a brilliant idea. They can execute it all on their own. That is not research that flies nowadays, nor should it be. This particular project wouldn't have happened without a very close partnership between, my epilepsy brain and our biomedical engineering group in Cleveland Clinic. The paper has and neurosurgery. So actually, if you look even at the authors in the paper, the first author is a neurosurgery resident who is now going through his PhD training at the clinic. And focusing, for 2 years on data science and machine learning. The two senior authors, so I'm co-senior with Dr. Carl Saab, who's a biomedical engineer. So, and then in the middle, the team has a couple of members from our epilepsy center. So Dr. Richard Burgess, who's a very senior EEGer, and a clinical epilepsy fellow. And then the rest are people from Carl's team. So you can see that the team itself is bringing together clinical epilepsy, epilepsy surgery research, neurosurgery, biomedical engineering, and computer scientists. And that's really the group that work together to have that continuity between, the idea to how we execute it, to technically what parts of the EEG we can do, how we should process them, and then, close that loop with something that is clinically meaningful. And for folks who engage in this type of research, I would really recommend replicating this model where you include the clinical expertise as heavily as you include the data science and computer science expertise. Those two should be equal and not serving the other. So what I mean by that is sometimes with these big data research projects, the clinicians are just viewed as the people who provide the data, and that's it. That's their role. They give us the data. We know what we want to do with it. We're the computer scientists, whatever, and then we will get it done. Or it is the other way around with we're the clinicians. We know what we have to do, and these other people should just run our analyses, and they don't matter, and they should not take credit, right? So, and neither one of these approaches makes sense. Our approach is one that I really encourage, not just because I like it, but because that's the one that really leads to high impact results. It's where both of these sides really work with each other with mutual respect and through listening, right? So we understand where the ideas and the concerns are coming from and then adapt along the way.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Neurology Live Mind Moments podcast. To support the show, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, for more neurology news and expert-driven content, visit neurologylive.com.